please welcome Melissa Sweet, Martha White, and the Portland Press Herald's Megan Doyle.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We are so lucky to have these two ladies here, and I know you're here to hear from them, not me. So let's get this started. One of the first questions I had upon meeting some writer was how you two met and came to know each other and collaborate on this project.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. Well, Martha and I lived in the same town of Rockport for a while, and we crossed paths at the grocery store and the Memorial Day parade, and I knew that she had grandchildren and had a couple of my books. And there was one other really special thing that happened for me with you. I don't think we ever even talked about this, but that was when I finished my first children's book, Carmine. I wanted to celebrate because I thought that if I was skewered with the reviewers, I might never write another book. And so I wanted to have a party. And in the book, there's the word knoll. And Martha's family had a knoll in Rockport, and I asked you if I could have the party there, and you said yes. And it was the best publication party ever. So I always really appreciated that vote of confidence that you gave me. So that's a few of the ways we know each other.
Right. So we were both in Rockport, and we did know each other a little bit through children in schools and parades and so forth. And the terrific party. Melissa, if you ever get a chance to go to one of Melissa's book parties, don't miss it. It's really an event of its own. But what I recall particularly is Melissa, I think, sending me a beautiful letter. If you ever get a letter from Melissa too, you'll know it comes in its own self-designed envelope. It has a special stamp. It has beautiful calligraphy handwriting. So this letter arrived, and it was that she was interested in doing the children's biography of E.B. White. And I had just, I'm the executor of my grandfather's literary estate, so I get the permissions, requests, so forth. I had just said no to somebody else who wanted to do a children's biography of E.B. White, and there had been others as well. But this one I had said, not Melissa's, but this other one that I had just said no to, I said to the woman, I don't think we're ever going to give permission for this because I just have yet to see that anybody could do it the way we think it ought to be done. Well, it was practically the next day that Melissa's letter came. And then I went to see her in her studio, which I'd never seen before, and she has a terrific studio that makes you want to be an illustrator instead of whatever else you already are. And she had already done probably a year's work in preparation, collages and a mock-up of the book, and the thing that really, or one of the things that sold it, other than my already loving Melissa's illustrations, was that she had figured out to do the book primarily by using E.B. White's own words to tell the story. And he saved everything, every letter, every scrapbook, every photo. So there are a lot of words to draw on, and it made perfect sense. And I saw the mock-up and I said, yes, it's yours.
Yes, you did.
And it just worked beautifully. I mean, we couldn't have been happier with the outcome of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was pretty much the impetus for the book, was when I had the idea to do a biography on E.B. White. I raced home because you know you have an uncut diamond in your lap. And I went to the bookshelf and I had Martha's book on this book actually, this well-used book of letters of E.B. White that Martha edited. And I pulled it off the shelf and I read a passage and I thought, oh, my heart sank. I thought, there is no way to mimic or paraphrase White's own writing. Who do I think I am doing this? So I said, well, wait a second. I'll give him center stage and I'll just pluck that passage. And then it started to occur. It is exactly how it started, was to let him, his own words, because the other thing was they were so accessible and delightful and clear and sincere that I thought any kid reading Charlotte's Web would want to read his letters, even parts of his New Yorker pieces, his poems, that had to be a biography that was accessible to his writing for another generation to learn about him. Yeah.
And now you have written, or you have worked on, illustrated a biography for young readers before. What makes a good candidate for a biography? Why did E.B. White fit for young readers?
Well, of course, a biography is about someone typically who has invented something. He or she was a lofty politician, or they did something in their life that we admire and want to find out how they did it. But what I'm always interested in addition to that, is who were they as kids, and how did they get from being the kid that they were? Was there a defining moment? Was there something they were interested in? So you have Peter Mark Roget's biography. It's a biography about the right word about the man who invented the thesaurus. Well, very early in that project, we learned that Peter Mark Roget was a list maker at about age 6. So you think, what are the chances of a list maker going on to write the thesaurus? Well, pretty good. Pretty good. So there's always this, often biographies come my way, and there's just something about it. I don't quite have the spark, or I don't see me as the best candidate. So, but when it hits, I know it's my book. And often it's about people artists, curious about their process.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to share with kids.
It made perfect sense to me that E.B. White would follow the book about the thesaurus, because my grandfather loved this thesaurus. I actually own the one that he used to have, this tattered pink, faded copy of a thesaurus, very well paged, little notations on the side, and you can just tell. And I had seen the book that you had just done, and I thought, well, of course, who do you follow? Roget with E.B. White.
It was a good segue for sure.
Yeah.
So one of the things I learned in reading about White as a child was that he had an early connection to Maine. Why was this state so important to his writing? What do you think it was that about Maine that shaped him?
Yeah, he was 6 must be a magical age for things to happen, because when he was about 6, his family started coming to Belgrade Lakes. He was born and raised in Mount Vernon, New York, and his father was a piano man. He ran a manufacturing company for pianos. And there were 6 children. E.B. was the youngest. Elwyn was young Anne was the youngest of the 6. And they got the idea as a family to come to Belgrade Lakes on the train at that point. And with all 6 children, the dog, the cook, everybody, trunks, I'm sure, arriving. And that became just the highlight of my grandfather's year. I mean, he looked forward to that August on Belgrade Lakes all year long. He wrote about it at his little school. He made a pamphlet. It's actually part of the book that Melissa did, a little pamphlet about the camp that they stayed with. And all of his life, he went back to that camp and stayed, for periods of time, because he just loved it so much. So when, he finished school, went to Cornell, became a writer at the New Yorker. He was living in New York City. When he finally earned enough money to be able to afford his own vacation, the first place they started to come was up the coast of Maine.
That's right, yeah.
And he and my grandmother would explore their way up the coast and rent a place to stay for a week or two, and found their way as far as East Blue Hill and saw a place for sale and bought the house in the 30s. Mm-hmm. And originally just started coming in the summer, and then very quickly my grandfather managed to turn it into a year away from work, and then the year extended into year-round, and they stayed. Mm-hmm. And it really was the place where he, I think, was most at home, did his best writing for sure. Actually, I should read that there's in the preface to One Man's Meat, which was the book of essays that he wrote when he had first come to Maine year-round. He wrote in the foreword, "Once in everyone's life there is apt to be a period when he is fully awake instead of half asleep. I think of those first 5 years in Maine as the time when this happened to me. I was suddenly seeing, feeling, and listening as a child sees, feels, and listens. It was one of those rare interludes that can never be repeated, a time of enchantment. I am fortunate indeed to have had the chance to get some of it down on paper. And that was, the foreword was written in 1982, but those early essays from One Man's Meat were late 30s, early 40s. And I think that, he was so excited to be in the country, to have a farm, to be able to have animals of his own, to get the gardens going. It was wartime. They were raising chickens for the egg production as his contribution to the war effort. And it was just, I think he suddenly found himself, able to go out and do chores, come into the office and work for a period of time, go out again, He never was a man who could just sit at the desk all day long. He really needed to be out and about, and Maine was just a perfect fit for him, I think.
Mm.
Yeah.
He had a lot of freedom as a kid, though. Like I'm sure many of us in this room, he free to go off on his bicycle, go ice skating. He explored outside, and Belgrade Lakes was the first. When his father gave him his first boat, I think he was 11. But they were out in boats before that. But he got an Old Town canoe from his dad, and I mean, once he had that, he was free to go off in the morning before everyone woke. And I think that feeling of being outside by himself too was a wonderful connection. I don't think that ever left him. That feeling of wanting to be off by himself and free to go off and explore a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. And his siblings were older, so they were, the Belgrade Lakes was where they were teaching him about turtles and fish, and they just had you can just imagine kind of how idyllic it might have been there for a kid that age, being pampered by all his siblings.
And no school.
And no school.
He was
the dream.
Didn't like being in the classroom that much either.
Yeah.
And I mean, later in life, how did his life on the farm in Maine? What was his writing process like? You said kind of come and go, or how did his day look like as he was working? Yeah,
I don't think there was a typical day. I mean, he had his routines. He got up, started the fire in the kitchen. It had certain routines of chores that needed to be done out in the barn, which he would do early. Come in, have his breakfast, and go into the office. But he would always come and go from the office, depending on what was happening in the season. He always had help on the farm. He was what would be called now a gentleman farmer. I mean, he wasn't a professional farmer in the sense of great production, although in those war years, the production was actually pretty good. I think he took it pretty seriously. But he definitely worked better by sitting down for an intense period of time and then leaving it and coming back to it. He was a great reviser, so he needed that time in between to come back with fresh eyes. And it was, of course, before word processors, so everything was cut and paste, and he would be down on the floor of his office with the shears and the paste pot and putting it all together. And that time in between, for the thinking process to happen was important. Melissa, in her book, describes the portable and manual typewriters that he had, and he used to say he always stuck with a manual typewriter even when the new electric ones came on, because he could only think as fast as he could type. And he was a hunt and peck typer all of his life. He wasn't a speedy typer by any means, but that pace was the right pace.
Yeah, I think he understood what he needed in terms of how he worked, and like many of us in the arts, that a lot of it's happening when we're taking a walk, when we're going to a museum, whatever it is, or just the work is happening up here. So for him to shingle his roof or take care of the pigs during that day was probably fed him as a writer as much as anything. It was also what
he was writing about a lot of the time.
That's true.
I mean, he was writing about the farm and about shingling the roof. And I mean, he had an uncanny ability to weave together, shingling the barn in wartime with talk of democracy or what was going on internationally. It was all very much of a piece. But I think that was his fodder. Just like when he was in New York City, he would be out and about on the streets of New York, and that, the encounter at the lunch counter would be what would it make its way into the notes and comments pieces or something.
Now, you are both writers who have also chosen to make your career in Maine.
Why? What about this state fuels you as writers like it fueled him?
I eventually, I grew up in New Jersey and migrated for college outside of Boston, and then came to Maine, to Acadia for a summer job. And I had only been to Maine once before with my dad, and I thought it was incredible. So spending a summer at Acadia National Park, when every break, every afternoon off, all weekend, a park is your playground, was amazing at age 20. So I fell in love with it, and I never thought about leaving. I went back and forth to Boston a little bit, but historically, artists have loved Maine for the light, for that changing landscape constantly, for the fact that we can talk about the weather ad infinitum, right? which we do all the time. And I think it's attracted a lot of artists. So the community here is wonderful, supportive, and engaging and inspiring. So there's always something going on. I think whether you live in the mid-coast or way up anywhere in Maine, I think there's communities that because I've been to a lot of schools in Maine, I've seen it happen, that they're very connected artistically and otherwise. I think people in Maine are just handy and crafty with their hands. And when I first got here, I had a farm. I lived on a saltwater farm in Waldoboro, and there was a barn, and knowing the ins and outs of an old barn and how everything is broken 8 times but fixed 7, and you just have that feeling of everything was kind of jury-rigged. The people were creative, and that just appealed to me, that kind of rough and tumbliness to it. So I never thought about leaving. I just moved here from Rockport, but it's sort of, I was saying to Martha, it's like exactly the same but bigger. There's a harbor, there's great people, there's a little more of everything.
But not too big.
Not too big. No, not at all. Yeah.
Well, and I, of course, sort of started out in Maine. I was born in Boston, but my grandfather was already here. My father grew up in Maine, and he was in Boston at MIT when he and my mother met. So my older brother and I were born in Boston. But then we went to Germany with my father in the war for a couple of years, and then my father came back to Maine. So we did when I was about 2. So I was here. And my father was a boat builder. My brother now is a boat builder. My husband is a boat builder. My son is now a boat builder. So Maine has a lot of good water for boats and a lot of good boats and people who can do that. So that has probably kept me here even more than the ability to write here or edit here. But Taylor, my husband, often says the best of the boat builders are the ones that come and work at the boatyard and then go away and do something else or work for another boat builder somewhere else, and then they come back to Rockport Marine. And I think that's kind of true for me, and it was probably true for my father and grandfather as well, I mean, for me, it wasn't until I left Maine, in Little Brooklyn, Maine, the high school closed just as my brother and I were approaching. They closed because they only had a graduating class of 2. And I guess the state decided that wasn't big enough, and so we went to Massachusetts for school. But it wasn't until I went away to school and came back that I realized that other people knew my grandfather other than as my grandfather. You know, it wasn't readily apparent to me as a child that he was a famous writer. Which was kind of a cool way to start out. He was just my grandfather, so when people would say, "Oh, what's it like to have E.B. White as your grandfather?" I'd say, "Well, what's your grandfather like?" He's my grandfather. Then it turned out a lot of people knew him, and the high school where I went was using Elements of Style and that sort of thing. And so coming back, you know, brought sort of a new appreciation. And I also, in my adult years, went off to New Hampshire, very far away, you know, worked for Yankee Magazine for 10 or 15 years, and then came back to Maine and happily ensconced here ever since.
So what was your process working together or working on Some Writer Like? How did this book come to be?
Well, after I had the idea, and Martha mentioned a little bit, I I kept researching, which is the really fun part of doing a biography, to my mind. That feeling of getting very curious. And Martha's mentioned a couple things about her grandfather. Well, we talked about the boats, but there were themes that kept popping up that were pretty interesting to me. One was eggs, weirdly. He's written a lot about eggs and chickens, and there's eggs play a big role in Charlotte's Web. Boats were there was like a legacy of the boat building, and the dogs. There was a legacy of his dogs that really interested me, and of course a manual typewriter. So it wasn't as if I was going to write a book about those four things, but in doing the research, I wanted to find out the genesis of all that. Where he turns out he had a really great dog when he was almost 6 years old, 8 or so, Mac, and from then on had this series of great dogs. So it's a process of reading everything I can and letting stuff bubble to the surface. The book started when my editor finally wanted to see something, and she said, well, at least give me the chapter titles. And I thought, oh, okay, I can do that, 13 chapter titles. But weirdly, they were very similar to what ended up being. And the premise of the book was that in order to tell the story of how his 3 children's books came to be, because I knew those stories didn't come out of thin air, I had to keep going back, and I really had to start at childhood to set the stage for who he was, his what he loved, and that he started using a typewriter at an early age to write to his brothers and sisters. So in doing that, it also had to include, of course, Belgrade Lakes, The New Yorker, meeting Catherine, and on to Stuart Little. So, that year before I contacted Martha was a rich one. And there was just another tidbit about our meeting about the book. Martha did tell me that there was I didn't know for sure. It was like a Thursday afternoon or a Friday. We agreed to meet on Monday. And I thought, wow, what if I can't do the book the way I see it? I didn't know. I had to sit with that a little bit, and I thought, I would have done it anyway. I wouldn't have cared for that year of researching him and hearing his books played on my tapes on my car over and over and over again. It was worth it. It was worth everything. So thankfully, I did get to do the book. But biography is always the writer's prerogative. It's all the things that really interested me. And of course, to tell the story of those 3 children's books and cover that how his writing process, how difficult writing might have been for him from time to time. I don't think it was easy for him, any easier than the rest of us. He had to stay put, and he was a meticulous editor and understood that part of the process was some bad first drafts. I
right.
think. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Somebody asked him once if something about was it fun to be a writer? Did he have fun writing? He said no, it wasn't fun being a writer. When he wanted to have fun, he'd go sailing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So what was your role in creating these books? How did you contribute, family memorabilia or other resources to this project?
Like I said, he saved everything, and so there were copies of all of his letters, and a lot of that material is at Cornell now. There's a rare book archive there that has something like 100 feet of shelves of V.B. White stuff, because he had given all of his manuscripts and so forth to Cornell by that time. But a lot of things still remained in the family. So a lot of the old scrapbooks, his early journals, duplicates of many of the photographs. And of course, I had already done the revised letters book and the E.B. White on Dogs book, I think, by then, and a book of quotations. So from those, I had my own, files and compilations of his work. So when Melissa said she was going to do this project, I said, well, let me bring you the home movies and the slides, and not slides, but the scrapbooks. And so that was kind of fun. It gave me an excuse to go again and see her studio, and it gave her more material that rather than having to go to Cornell, which here to Ithaca is quite a ride.
Although I did go to Cornell, and you paved the way for a few people for me to meet, which was awesome. But it was as if when Martha showed up with E.B. White's scrapbooks that he had put together and the home movies, it felt like the floodgates had opened, and that feeling of the vote of confidence made a very big difference in how I felt about doing the book, because I had all the material I needed. As White once said, it gave him, about another topic, it gave him courage to go on, and I definitely felt more courage, because all I had to do was sort it out, just sort of sift through and see what rose to the top. Yeah.
Now, you were writing this book with young readers in mind, and you're writing about one of the most famous children's book writers of all time. What was his approach for writing for children, and how did you keep that in mind as you wrote for children?
Well, so he wrote the three children's books. Stuart Little came to him in a dream. And at that time, he was riding on a train. He had a dream about a little mouse, dapper little mouse, all dressed up. He woke up, being a good writer, wrote it all down, and that was the genesis of Stuart Little. And being I guess, semi-shy uncle with lots of nieces and nephews, when they would visit, they would want a story, but he would rather not do off the cuff, so he would read them from Stuart Little. And the book goes into great detail about him writing that whole story. And I could show a couple. We could cue a couple slides just to show a little bit of the process about how I thought about it visually. This is Rockport, and I maintain that Martha and I do not live in that beautiful house on the coast.
Although I have stayed there.
But we can keep going for a second. I'm going to get to a few slides that show a little bit about my process, and we'll keep going after this one too. I believe there's, So the cover was curious because always with marketing, and I think you can hit Q, and there will be some illustrations that were preliminary work coming across the screen. And of course, part of doing a picture book at this time is the marketing will weigh in, and they definitely wanted a picture of E.B. White, a photograph. And I mentioned this to Martha, and she was thankfully like, no, don't put a photograph on the cover. There isn't a good enough one, and there really wasn't. And what age do you choose? So in this case, I picked him about the time he might have gone to the farm, bought the farm and gone to the farm to have animals for the first time at that age. Long before he was white-haired with a mustache, so it was a moment in time. And you can see that even for the revisions for a cover, you may do a couple dozen. We can keep queuing if you like. And so, of course, I talked about Martha's book, and we can keep going, and we'll get to this point where you see me fooling around with a manual typewriter. The book that I knew him best from was The Elements of Style. And I had about 7 copies between my house and my studio, loving this book, his essay in the back, The Approach to Style. And I thought, I know I can be a writer if I just follow the rules of this book, and I totally trust it like a Bible. We can keep going. And so, of course, the eggs played a big role right on the end papers. The front and back end papers have eggs, and follow through here. So I wanted to answer the questions. How many drafts did it take to do Charlotte's Web? And was it difficult for him? And the next slide shows us him at the New Yorker with his dachshund Minnie on his desk. Of course, I was like, why is there a dog on his desk? And there's that ubiquitous typewriter. And we can keep going, please, thanks. His time at Belgrade Lakes, and we'll do next. And the dogs. So I'm getting a lot of research early on. And I followed his advice. I was tidy and I was brave. As tidy as a person like me can be in the studio. And of course I had this practice. I had a little bit of preparation to do these books with Roger. And we'll cue that. And the next book is a book about the man who invented the Macy's parade balloon. So I had a little bit of understanding how to research and find the essence of someone, and we'll keep going. And so when I found out that he had fallen in love with the sound of an early typewriter, that was a big cue for me that had to be part of the book next. And so I started doing a drawing of a manual typewriter, and of course, being a collage artist, I wanted to cut apart a manual typewriter, and I did. But the designers said, wait a second, kids aren't going to know what a manual typewriter is, so we need the instructions right at the beginning of the book. And next slide, please. That allowed us also to say, when you see those table of the contents and the keys, you can see how I'm using it, and of course, suddenly it all begins to make sense. And this is also how the book begins to design itself. So if I'm going to have typewriter keys at the beginning, I'm going to carry it through. Have a couple, and I'm going to take his quotes and type them up on a manual typewriter. That's another design element carried through, so that when you're reading some writer, when you get to these typed passages, you know they're E.B. White's, distinguished from my text. And each one is labeled so that in the back of the book you can find where that piece of writing is from and go read the whole thing. So there's quite a bit of back matter, and back matter in children's books is becoming like a whole nother book. It's really kind of exciting that kids are using back matter. And then you can see how I use this within a piece of art. So it really is the combination of merging, sort of like a remix of the family photos, my new art, his writings, all melded into one, gestalt. Thank you, thank you, gestalt. I knew you were going to say that. No, just kidding. I like that word. Thank you. So we'll leave it here for a few minutes, I guess. Yeah. So that's a little bit how I thought about it.
And we've talked a little bit about the elements of style and his commitment to editing and writing in this very fastidious way. Was that intimidating? Is it to approach and to write? For me, I would be intimidated.
Yeah, it was. But being able to use his passages allowed him to tell the important parts of the story. And I considered my work, my writing, and the art like a hinge. So you open the hinge, and then you get a passage by him. And it was a beautiful process to keep my writing as simple, as he said, writing with simplicity, clarity, and sincerity. That is how your voice comes, and that's true in art too. And it's that way in making art, to make it as heartfelt as possible. That what's true to me is what the reader will respond to. And he wrote that he himself wrote for an audience of one, and I think that was great advice. I couldn't be him, but I could be me. And I'm really curious if you were intimidated by the elements of style.
Yes, yes. But I had a couple of pieces of knowledge. One which was that he also made mistakes.
Yeah.
His, I think, first book he dedicated to his mother, and he got her name wrong.
That's crazy.
And I still own some editions of the books that have corrections written in them. And when I was doing the E.B. White on dogs, I think it was, for Tilbury House, I had a terrific editor then at Tilbury House, Jennifer Bunting. She no longer works with them, but she was driven crazy because there were a couple of places where he used which and that in the wrong way, and it was all. I said to her, "We're just going to leave, his words as they are. They're the way he wrote them. We're not going to edit that." And she said, "But they're wrong." I said, "Well, we can put a note in the front to say that, but we're not going to change it." So that helps. Everybody makes mistakes.
I'm kind of curious who in this audience had the elements of style growing up, or knew it from college,
from school, sure.
Yeah, a lot. Okay, that's good. That's not typical. So, yeah, bravo.
Now, we've talked a little bit about, and you can read about it in the book, about White's kind of shyness and his feeling that writers shouldn't be celebrities, or he didn't want to be a celebrity. What do you think he would think about being the subject of a biography? And was that something that you thought about as you wrote this book?
I did not think about that for 1 second. I honestly didn't. I felt like if I had Martha's she knew her grandfather. If she had felt he never would have wanted that, I don't think we would have done it.
Right,
yeah,
but he had already authorized the adult biography that Scott Elledge did, and that actually took place during his lifetime. Scott Elledge spent 16 years trying to put it together. My grandfather was afraid Scott Elledge was going to die before he did. And it was close, but he pulled it off. And so my grandfather had gone through that process with Scott Elledge and was allowed to make corrections of a factual type for that book, and he was very funny about that process. He was very hands-off, but he did make a number of corrections, and there were a lot of letters back and forth that are, actually some of them are in the revised letters book. They're funny reading. At one point he tried to talk Scott Elledge out of it, saying he was no Truman Capote, he hadn't murdered anybody, or didn't have enough wives or something like that, hadn't lived. He'd spent all of his life crouched over a typewriter, and he didn't think that was going to be very interesting to anybody. But he had given permission for it, and I think he would have loved Melissa's version even more, because it was intended for children and had the sort of playful end of things and much more of the nature in it. So.
Yeah, I think he was mesmerized by Scott Elledge's biography, that there was so much detail about his life. He thought, I think he was just stunned. Or that's how the letters read.
Well,
he was like,
how did you uncover
all this?
He didn't know what he was thinking when he was thinking it, or Scott Elledge sort of read into things in a much more complex way than I think my grandfather ever really ascribed to himself. But.
And why was it important to you that children could read this book about him and learn about his life and maybe take something away for themselves?
Well, there's a few reasons. And one is that E.B. White, to my mind, had such a conviction about the way he lived his life. I think that's something that's always interesting and inspiring and even attractive. Like, who is this person that said no to all the fame and fortune in New York? The Algonquin Round Table, I mean, that was Harold Ross at the New Yorker doing that. And E.B. White really took no part in that. He was sought out, but where he was happiest was his farm in Maine. So did he give up anything? Probably not in his mind. But I think today it's difficult to say, this is the life I believe in and I'm going to do it. And I wanted to share it. That process is really inspiring to me, like to craft a life you believe in. And I wanted kids to learn about that. And I also, thank you. And I also felt that as a writer, I never get tired of reading him. It always feels fresh. And I feel that that's because he was so careful in his editing. The sentences just sort of land on the page. Like, I liken it to like new fallen snow. It doesn't get any, he did his job, and I just never got tired of it. And I felt that they should know more than his 3 children's books, because they're still, to pick up his book of letters and think about writing a letter even. Wow, to write tens of thousands of letters in your lifetime is just incredible. I know, I am such a fan that I get so enthusiastic about him that I can hardly bear it.
And that that it's one of the reasons I put the E.B. White on dogs together as well, because children often say they all wish that there was a sequel. They all want to know, did Stuart find Marlowe, and did what happened with Charlotte's Web and so forth. They sometimes say, would I write a sequel, or could they write a sequel? And it occurred to me with the E.B. White on dogs, those essays about his dogs, which the dogs don't appear in the children's books, but he wrote very funny essays about his dogs. And I thought, well, here's a book that maybe can bring those children into the adult world of E.B. White and some of the wonderful essays that he did, not just about dogs, but about so many topics. But it seemed like a good segue is to put that book together.
And even this book, in the words of E.B. White, Martha has a beautiful foreword that also, it's almost like a short biography of him. I think kids would love that.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
I
about
really
growing up with him.
enjoyed.
He was very, I use the word childlike himself. He retained that sense of wonder about the world, and he was very able to transmit that, especially with children. He loved to show children his farm and go see the chickens or go down to the shore, and he never lost that ability to be surprised and at wonder by the natural world, and that was really a gift. He was a terrific grandfather in that sense.
And you've compiled some of his other writings, and you're currently working on a compilation of his writings on democracy. Why do you think his words still resonate with adults as well as children?
Yeah, I would love to know the answer to that. He had an uncanny ability to, maybe because his topics were such basic ones or classic ones, they simply stand the test of time. But right now I'm working on a collection of E.B. White on freedom and democracy, and you read some of the essays that he wrote in The Wild Flag or in One Man's Meat or the different collections that are on these topics, and it's as if he's writing for the political world today. I mean, he wrote about nationalism, about fascism, about democracy, about freedom, liberty, freedom of the press, not wanting the press to merge into one huge conglomerate. I mean, all the issues that we're talking about in the news today are right there, and his views on them are so current. And I keep, I kept looking at squibs, and my impulse was to send them off to the newspapers as a letter to the editor, because fascism was in the news again, and nationalism is in the news again, and look what E.B. White said. He already told us, what we need to know.
Do it.
Yeah, I am. I'm doing it. Can I read one little bit? He wrote just this terrific, it's a definition of democracy. And this may be the preface to the book. I don't know. It's going to be in there. Somebody had written to him and said, could he write the meaning of democracy? They wanted him to define the meaning of democracy. So he writes, "We received a letter from the Writers' War Board the other day asking for a statement on the meaning of democracy. It presumably is our duty to comply with such a request, and it is certainly our pleasure. Certainly the board knows what democracy is. It is the line that forms on the right. It is the don't in Don't Shove. It is the hole in the stuffed shirt through which the sawdust slowly trickles. It is the dent in the high hat. Democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half the people are right more than half of the time. It is the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is a letter to the editor. Democracy is the score at the beginning of the ninth. It is an idea which hasn't been disproved yet, a song the words of which have not gone bad. It's the mustard on the hot dog and the cream in the rationed coffee. Democracy is a request from a war board in the middle of a morning, in the middle of a war, wanting to know what democracy is." And you just think that we need more writers like this today. So.
I think we all vote for that for the forward of the
Yes.
Well, I'll ask one more question, and then we can turn it over to the audience. I think the last on my list here, we talked a little bit about his life as a writer, and as two writers in the present day. What do you think has changed about the world of publishing since White was working on his own books and his own essays?
Wow.
Well, you have to be a celebrity today.
Yeah,
you have to do your own dog and pony show. There's not as many editors, not as much advertising.
Right. It is a little more expected that authors will go off and promote their book. Social media, I doubt he would have had anything. No. No. We can't speak
He wouldn't
for him.
have friended anyone.
No. But so those changes are the most evident ones. But when I got started in children's books, the examples that I had were Maurice Sendak had Ursula Nordstrom, also White's editor in New York, and these would be your editors for the rest of your life. Well, now you could have a different editor or a different publisher with every book. It's not only do the people in the publishing houses move around, it's just in order to make a living, you need to do a certain number of books a year, and that might come from all different publishers. So there's but I don't think the day-to-day feeling of going to, the privilege it is really to go to your studio, to work for 4, 6, 8 hours on creative work has changed that much. I think it's still the essence of what we do is that we have an idea and as unglamorous as it seems, we keep uncovering and get very curious and work it till we've got a project to be published. So that part hasn't changed, I would say, right? No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we will turn this over to questions. I would just ask that you guys wait for the microphone so you can be heard throughout the room. All right. Who's going to be brave? Come on.
Be tidy.
My name is Susan, and one of the things I love about your book is the collages.
Thank you.
I'm in love with collage. I'd love to come to your studio because I bet you've got stuff everywhere. The idea of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So how disorganized is it?
Oh, wow. Well, it is disorganized because part of the beauty of collage is serendipity. And you have to have it out in order to find that thing. And I can't even tell you how many times I'm like pushing something aside and I see this thing that's uncovered that's the perfect thing. So it is, I try to, I was going to say it's fairly disorganized. It's mayhem. And I just keep it out because, and then sometimes between books I can clean it up. But it was a great way to do this book because it was very difficult. For instance, there's 3 large collages for each of his children's books, and for me to make these sort of shadow boxes of elements also got me to know his work better by carving Stuart Little's little car and making the canoe and putting these collages together. Collage is a slower process, and sometimes slower is to our advantage. It's not always the best to find this snappy solution because it's in the work that we figure it out. So yes, but the rest of my house, my poor husband who's here, I don't really say, what's that book doing on that shelf? It's like, keep it clean. I can't stand it because my studio is such chaos. So I have this contrast in our house.
Yeah. Now, I will tell you, I was in her Rockport studio, and it was 2 floors, and as you came in the door, it was a beautiful little building. The colors were, the whole house had color choices that you think, why didn't I think of that? Everywhere. And on the walls, collages of collections that Melissa has found, I assume, here and there.
Yeah.
But what I was immediately struck by going into the first floor level where there were drawers and cubbies and things everywhere, and you just want to go open every drawer and see what's in it because it's something wonderful. And then up on the second floor was where your desk and the paint pots and the real creative work, I'm guessing, was mostly going on up there. I think she must have cleaned up before I came over because
I did.
It looked pretty good to me.
I did. Phew. Yeah.
All right, I think we had a question right over here.
Oh, thank you. Hi, one of my favorite E.B. White quotes, and Melissa, I will probably destroy it in trying to paraphrase it because I don't have it in front of me, but it said something like, when I rise in the morning, I'm torn between a desire to improve the world and a desire to enjoy the world.
Yeah.
It makes it hard to plan the day.
Yes.
And I'm thrilled to know, Martha, that the book on democracy is coming because to me that has a lot of resonance with making it hard to plan the day when you want to do
Yes.
both those things. My question is for Melissa, actually. Does your artistic life play out in that way? You can enjoy and improve the world?
Oh,
I so
wow.
appreciate your products, and they seem so full of integrity.
Thank you. I found a great quote that I will share with you if I could find it quickly. It's by the reviewer Julian Barnes. And he suggests that in all the arts, there are usually two things going on at the same time: the desire to make it new and a continuing conversation with the past. And as innovators, we're always looking to the past for inspiration. So some of my day is, if someone else did it, Joseph Cornell did great shadow boxes, and I think I can too, that's a help, but always to recreate it newly. And I think that there's a healthy mix when you work for yourself of going outside and walking your dog, like White went and shingled the roof. So there's this nice balance of working and being committed to that discipline of working, but also exploring and giving yourself that's also work. And you're doing your job if you take a break and you go out and be attentive to what's going on out there. So politically, I think that I feel that artists, even writers, all of us who are creative people in this room, our best contribution to the planet is to do the work that we love, because art makes a gigantic difference in people's lives. And I don't have a snappy way to say this, but without it, we would not be as wealthy in our creative world. So I think that we have to have it. And so I think that if artists just go do their job, they're doing their job.
All right, so mine's not really a question, but my favorite quote from E.B. White is, anyone who writes down to children is simply wasting his time. Yes. Right? You have to write up, not down. Children are demanding. Right? They're the most attentive, curious, eager, observant, sensitive, quick, and generally congenial readers on earth. They accept almost without question anything you present them with, as long as it is presented honestly, fearlessly, and clearly. I love that. And so mine is more of a comment that my daughter's in 3rd grade this past year, and they read some writer. And she's a Mainer, right? And she fell in love with E.B. White. We've read every book by him, and it resonated. It resonated for me as an adult rereading it from when I read it from when I was a child. Stuff was still relevant. It was still magical. It was really, and it was amazing to watch another generation fall in love with him. And so from your book, where she got fired up about it, to actually reading the words, it really was a bridge. And it was just amazing. So not really a question, just a comment that it's working and it's beautiful. Like it was really like, it was like, wow, this is why I'm a parent, to read these books again with them. But it fired them up. And my daughter now, she's finishing 3rd grade, and she is like loving collage, and so she makes it herself. So you're awesome. Just saying, it's inspiring, and it's continuing to inspire future generations, which is fabulous. So thank you.
Yeah, I think one thing E.B. was really good at with the children's books was having fun with words and showing kids that words can be really fun. And he was coming up on the time when some of the children's book publishers were beginning to think only certain kinds of smaller words should be used in children's books. And there was a time where they actually made lists of which words should go into books. Essentially dumbing them down and imagining that children can't take a big word like fantastic or something with 3 syllables or more. When he had Charlotte searching for words with Templeton getting the radiant off the soapbox, that was, I think, a little bit of a poking fun at some of the publishers, saying, well, we could find a word over here, And I think he took a lot of joy in that, and it's absolutely true. I mean, the children's letters that still come today prove absolutely that there has yet to be a word or a situation in any of the children's books that throw the children. The parents may be thrown. Some of the parents were thrown when Stuart was a mouse instead of a baby. But the children never asked that question. Just recently, I had one letter recently, which I think is interesting to throw out. That I've never had this before, and I think it comes from modern time today. One child recently asked me, why was Avery allowed to bring his air gun on the school bus? And there is a picture of Avery, the little boy, and he has a pop gun or an air gun or something, and he speaks. You don't see him getting on the bus with it, but he speaks of running for the bus, and he's still got the air gun. I thought, wow, that's observant. That's a letter that has never come before, and it speaks more to today's world than anything else.
No question.
What do you think? There's been 2 movies about Charlotte's Web. What do you think your grandfather would have thought about that? I mean, Paul Lynde, from the 70s here, played, some of the characters, and then it was, redone. Steve Buscemi, whatever. But what do you think your dad would have thought of the movie and how that portrayed Charlotte's Web?
Yeah, I don't think he would have particularly thought it was true to the book. He did give permission, in a sense. He resisted it all of his lifetime, but he did essentially say he thought at some point, it was going to happen and we should let it happen. So there was some guidance around that. The decision on the family and really came down to, was it going to continue to sell books, which it certainly did, and were the books going to remain the primary thing, which they certainly have. There are movies of Stewart as well, and in my sense, they're even worse. And so I don't think I'm not even sure he would have gone to see them, frankly. He did go once to a stage production of Charlotte's Web put on, as a play, and enjoyed that, and that's also pretty different than the books. But his rule of thumb around all things theatrical was to say no when you could. So I think he was glad to not have to see it in his lifetime, but also kind of knew it was going to come down the road. Yeah.
One thing that we talked a little bit about illustration, so I did want to give you guys the opportunity to mention the show that folks here might be interested in while we're seeking out our next question over there.
At the Curtis Library in Brunswick, there's a wonderful show sponsored by the Illustrators Institute from Scott Nash on Peaks Island. It's a show of Garth Williams' work. So if you know Garth Williams from Stuart Little, Charlotte's Web, Little House on the Prairie, it's a beautiful show of preliminary work and final work, and really a treat that we have that in the state right now. I mean, we don't usually, we don't often get a premier illustrator traveling show, so it's awesome.
It's also a terrific library. I've not seen it. It's got a great children's. It's a show you could certainly bring children to. It's all over the upper story of the library, and they have 6 or 8 volunteer docents that will take you through if you want to have somebody talk to you about the illustrations.
Yes.
And it's there through the end of July, and then I think it goes to Nebraska or somewhere.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Definitely worth the pilgrimage.
Exhibit. Yeah. Very worth seeing.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think, do we have a question back there?
Hi, I'm a middle school and high school teacher, and I often worry about wonder. You talked about E.B. White being able to hold on to this wonder in this 3rd grader who's been able to connect through your book. And that I often worry my students don't have time or are not bored enough to wonder due to the technology and pace of their lives. And so I wonder, Melissa, going to schools, if you've found ways for students to hold on to that and how to foster that throughout their lives.
It is surely a conundrum because so much of our growing up was that, like as I mentioned about White, just that, and your childhood too, that free-range feeling of being able to make your own fun, have your own fights in the neighborhood. People aren't talking to each other, and you come back together and play kick the can. So it was always this kind of in and out. We had TV, but we made our own fun. And I don't have, they know the second I'm being didactic. So they stop, I couldn't say, and if you really want some fun this afternoon, put your cell phone down and go outside. They wouldn't like that. So I do come at it from the point of view that White spent a lot of time outside and really fell in love with the outdoor world, and so where do ideas come from? That's the contribution I can give them. Where do ideas come from? White's books came right out of his own backyard, his own life, and that's true for everything. I mean, an idea about anything can be right in front of us if we're looking. A lot of times I think books on poets, I did a book on William Carlos Williams, but there's other poets too. They were also people who mused and took time to take note of what was going on around them. I don't have a solution for that. I can only imagine the challenge of being a parent and trying to get kids to... Does anybody here have a suggestion? Because I'd be so curious if parents have a theory of how to do it, or limit it, pardon?
You're more interested in the middle school, high school.
I don't know how young are kids when they're getting cell phones now. You have to say this many hours and that is it.
You have to let them go outside. You have to set a timer.
Yeah.
You have to get them off of it.
Yeah.
It's a very addicting.
But you do wonder what a generation of kids who, despite having gigantic thumbs, are going to be doing with how they'll interact with the world, because it will be different, but they will.
Yeah,
They
and
will.
I think there's the beginnings of some movement, even in the preschools and elementary schools, of getting children outside more, letting them free range as a classroom together.
Yeah.
The little preschool in Rockport is putting up a yurt this summer because they want an
awesome.
outdoor classroom that will get them into the woods.
I have heard of classes where what I call the associational time is actually dedicated to some of that, not just having the interaction.
Yeah.
But there's such research about if the device is on the desk and visible, what happens on certain measures, as opposed even to the device being somewhere under the desk. There's a 6 or 10 point change in operational intelligence, and if it's offside altogether, further. And that's sort of terrifying in its way.
Yes.
And I do sense that our neurology and the neurology of the young is being programmed to accommodate these devices in ways that requires an intentional, serious intentional thing to having experiences. And I know a college professor who does this with his kids to have them spend some time at the beginning of class in empty space, associational time, because our brains need that fuel. And you and your generation, even more mine, I'm 80, that was a taken for granted field of play.
Yeah.
We don't have that field of play.
Right.
This part is shrinking, this part is growing.
Yeah.
And before you know it, the devices are going to have us instead of us having the devices. So.
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone? Any takers?
All right. This is for Melissa. Have you ever considered writing a picture book memoir?
I had a small child ask me that a few years ago, and it was very sweet. And maybe sometime, to see maybe the connection to making art as a kid, something like that would be really fun. Yeah. I know I'm getting to be the age where I should probably think about that before it's too late.
But then you'd have to grow up.
Oh no, that would be terrible.
When you both interact with young readers, what are some of the questions they ask you about your lives? That maybe questions we haven't asked tonight.
I had somebody ask me if Stuart Little was my grandfather.
Yes. That is so funny.
Made me feel really little.
I had this maybe 8-year-old girl in Texas say to me, I show them pictures of my studio, and I'm working a little bit in a little video, and I say I work alone, I'm my own boss. I go to the studio by myself, and she came up to me later, and she looked at me so intently, and she said, "You spend the whole day by yourself?" I said, "Yeah, I really actually like it." And she said, "I think I would like that." And I said, "Pay attention to that, because that's important information for you.
Yeah.
Just don't forget that." But as an aside, I know there's at least 2 people in this room that teach at Maine College of Art illustration. They teach illustration. The head of the department is here. And I've been to their classroom, and I'm completely encouraged that their students are not all digital. They love to make stuff by hand. So I think we're at a time, and we'll look back and say, "Can you believe we're on our phones all that time?" I think we'll get past it. I trust humanity. I hope you all do too. I don't know. I don't have an answer. So thank you.
That's a good way to end.